Welcome to this video. In this video we're going to discuss the anatomy and histology of the lungs. Now all of the parts to this video will be placed in the playlist on the respiratory system, so if you're struggling to find the next part in the video, do go to the playlist on the respiratory system. Okay, so as the title says then, we're going to firstly start off by discussing the gross anatomy of the lungs, and then we're going to move on to discussing the histology or the microanatomy of the lungs. So I hope by the end of this video you'll have a good picture inside your head of what the lungs actually look like and what they are made up of. So what they look like on a large scale and what they look like on a small scale. So we'll start off with the gross anatomical picture. So the first picture then that I'm going to draw is what you would be able to see if you had X-ray vision and you could see through someone's anterior chest wall, through the pleura, both layers of it, the parietal pleura and the visceral pleura, and you could actually see the lungs underneath. Now note, I am not saying that this is what you would see if you were to take the lungs out of the chest. If you were to take the lungs out of the chest, it will cause the lungs to deflate. The lungs are only inflated up and kept at their normal lung volume when they're inside the chest. And in future videos in the playlist on the respiratory system, I will explain static lung mechanics and the fact that the pressure in the intrapleural space is lower than the pressure inside the alveoli, and that's what creates that transpulmonary pressure which keeps the lungs inflated. So it's very important then that I say this is what you would see if you were to have X-ray vision and you could see the lungs within the chest, not what you would see if you were actually to take the lungs out of the chest. Okay, so let me draw pictures then. So of course we have two lungs, we have a right lung and a left lung, so I'll start by drawing the right lung, which is slightly larger than the left lung, and I'll try and draw this reasonably large. Okay, so here is my picture then of the right lung, and now I'll put on the left lung, and the left lung is smaller than the right lung, and the reason for that is that there is a notch in the left lung, and this notch is where the heart is present. So there's an indentation in the left lung down here to make room for the heart, and you'll see this once I've drawn the picture. So it's not a mirror image, instead there is this notch where you've gouged a bit out effectively to make room for the heart. So here now is my picture of the left lung. So this notch then in the left lung, which makes the left lung smaller than the right lung, this has a special name. This is known as the cardiac, of course, just meaning pertaining to the heart, and then notch. After all, this is a notch in the left lung. Okay, and just bear with me a moment because this pen has run out of ink, so I'll just transition over to a fresh pen. Okay, so, got my fresh pen. So this is the cardiac notch, this indentation in the left lung to make room for the heart. So that's all very basic. So, what I now want to show you then is the different fissures in both of the two lungs, which divide the lungs into lobes. So we'll start off with the right lung. So the right lung has two fissures in it, and what do I mean by a fissure? Well, a fissure just effectively means a crack. So these are effectively just going to be spaces which divide the lung into separate lobes, and I'll explain that a bit more in a moment. So on the right lung here, you're going to have two fissures, one like so, and the other like this. And these really are just cracks, they're divisions in the structure of the lung. So if I was a little man walking along the surface of the right lung here, like so, then I'd eventually get to this crack and I would have to jump across that onto this next bit. Indeed, if I was very small and I was capable of non-physical movements, I'd be able to walk down the edge here. So if there was no sort of gravity or anything, and I was just able to walk along the surface of this, and then I'd be able to walk down the crack. You know, it's a space in between this lobe of the right lung and this lobe of the right lung. So taking my hand, I'd be able to put my hand inside that fissure there. Okay, so these are deep creases in the structure of the lung which divide the lung into these separate lobes. So we've got three separate lobes of the right lung here, and before I give you the names of those, let me just show you the fissure that there is in the left lung as well. There's only one in the left lung, and it's just like so. Okay, so what are the names of these fissures then? So this fissure here, because it's horizontal, it is known as the horizontal fissure. Now you could just call it the horizontal fissure, but help your listener out and call it the horizontal fissure of the right lung. So this is the horizontal fissure of the right lung, and I should stress that we are looking at the lungs from the front here. So this is the patient's right lung and this is the patient's left lung, just to make sure everyone's oriented. Okay, so this is the horizontal fissure here, and I'll colour that in blue. Now, these two fissures, these are known as the oblique fissures. This, of course, is the oblique fissure of the right lung, and this is the oblique fissure of the left lung. So oblique is an old word effectively meaning diagonal. So these are the diagonal fissures effectively in the lungs. So you have an oblique fissure of the right lung and an oblique fissure of the left lung. So I'll just colour these in orange here. So overall, the right lung then has two fissures, the horizontal fissure and an oblique fissure, and then the left lung just has one fissure, which is the oblique fissure. Okay, so now to talk about the lobes that these fissures divide the lungs into. So starting with the right lung here, it's all very simple. The topmost portion of lung tissue here is known as the superior lobe, the middle portion is known as the middle lobe, and the inferior portion is known as the inferior lobe. So I'll just write those down here. So we have a superior lobe, like so, which is this one here. Then we have the middle lobe, which is the one in between the horizontal fissure and the oblique fissure, and then finally we have an inferior lobe. Now, do not be fooled by the apparent sizes of these lobes as seen from this picture from the front. You would look at this picture and say, look, the inferior lobe's tiny compared to the superior lobe. However, the inferior lobe is a lot bigger than you would think, and the reason is that these fissures that I've drawn on, they do not just go directly down in this picture. So if I was to put my hand into, say, the oblique fissure, it does not, my hand would not move just directly down into the page like this. So if we've got the lungs in the position as they're drawn on the piece of paper, my hand would not just move directly down like that. Instead, it would go at an angle like this, and that means that actually the inferior lobe is a lot bigger than this picture would suggest. So do not be fooled into thinking that these fissures just go directly down. They're much more complicated than that, the paths they follow, which means that the shapes of the lobes are far more complicated than this picture would suggest, and therefore their sizes are much more complicated than this picture would suggest. Okay, so now going on to the left lung, this very large lobe here, although again this fissure doesn't go directly down, so the lower lobe here is much bigger than the picture would suggest. This is known as the superior lobe, and this is the inferior lobe. However, one more point to add on here is that we often think of the superior lobe as having a separate little portion as part of it, which is effectively equivalent to the middle lobe that the right lung has. Now let me make this quite clear. The left lung does only have two lobes. It has the superior lobe and the inferior lobe. It doesn't have a middle lobe. However, there's effectively a bit that's equivalent to the middle lobe, and this is known as the lingula. Okay, and the lingula is, and I won't do it in green because we've used that for the cardiac notch, I'll do it in red. The lingula is this little bit down here, so near where the heart would be. So the lingula is functionally equivalent to the middle lobe. So it's part of the superior lobe, but we can think of it as being functionally equivalent to the middle lobe. And what do I mean by functionally equivalent to the middle lobe? Well, in the tracheobronchial tree, which we'll come on to, there are bronchi which go to each of the three lobes of the right lung, and bronchi on the left side which go to the top part of the superior lobe, the lingular part of the superior lobe, and then the inferior lobe. So as far as the tracheobronchial tree is concerned, the lingula is effectively equivalent to the middle lobe on the right lung. But as you can see, there's no fissure dividing it from the superior lobe, as indeed there is on the right lung. Okay, so there's the gross anatomy then of the lungs. Now what I want to talk about is the gross anatomy of the tracheobronchial tree, and then we'll go on to the histology of the tracheobronchial tree and also get down to the histology of the alveoli. But before we actually begin that, I just want to give you the basic answer as to what the lungs are actually made up of. So let's ask this very blunt question: what are these things actually made up of? Because they're very, very light. If you've ever felt a pair of lungs, they are incredibly light. They're similar in density to sponges, a bath sponge that you might have used. And that's because mainly they are full of air. So the lungs, the main thing that they consist of is loads and loads of alveoli, which are effectively little air pockets surrounded by very thin layers of cells. So drawing what the lung parenchyma basically consists of, I draw a picture like so. So here is an alveolus, here is another alveolus, here's another alveolus, here's another alveolus, so you just have loads and loads of alveoli all next to each other like so. So these are all representing alveoli, the singular for which is alveolus. And these are effectively little air pockets, so the centre is full of air, and then the surrounding of the pocket is made up of cells, very thin cells, and that's what alveoli consist of. And as I say, there's air in the centre, and this air is going to be giving oxygen, hopefully, to the blood and taking carbon dioxide from the blood. So where are the blood vessels? Well, the blood vessels are in between the alveoli. So in between the layers of cells that line the alveoli, you're going to have loads of little capillaries like so. So drawn in red here, this is meant to represent a pulmonary capillary. So this is what the lung parenchyma actually consists of. Loads and loads of alveoli with pulmonary capillaries moving in between those alveoli. And of course, these are the places where the primary function of the lungs is actually taking place. And of course, the primary function of the lungs is gas exchange, to bring oxygen into the blood and remove carbon dioxide from the blood. So all of these alveoli are effectively going to be joined by a great big network of tubes that is going to connect them to the outside world, so that we can bring fresh air into the alveoli and then get rid of it at the end of breathing, so when we're breathing out, and then replace it with more fresh air. Right, so that's the basic answer of what the lung parenchyma actually consists of. Loads and loads of little alveoli spaces. And of course, in between all of the alveoli, inside the lungs, you're going to have this tube network, which is actually going to be delivering fresh air from the external world into these alveoli spaces. And that's what I want to now turn my attention to. So we're now going to discuss the tracheobronchial tree, and we'll then move on to the histology of the tracheobronchial tree. So the tracheobronchial tree, so we are going to begin the respiratory tract with the trachea. Now you could begin the respiratory tract, and indeed the respiratory tract really does begin with the mouth and the nose, and then the pharynx, the throat, and then down into the larynx. However, drawing the larynx is extremely complicated. The anatomy of the larynx is extremely complicated. The anatomy of the pharynx is extremely complicated. So I don't want to draw all of that and confuse the picture. Instead, we're just going to begin the respiratory tract with the trachea, and then go down from there and see all of the bronchi and bronchioles coming off there. So we're now going to discuss the anatomy of the tracheobronchial tree, and we'll then discuss the histology of it, and we'll work down until we finally get onto the histology of the alveoli. Okay, so the tracheobronchial tree. So I'll start by drawing the trachea then. So here, this can represent the trachea. So the trachea will come down in the neck, and indeed you can feel it in your neck at the suprasternal notch. So if you go to your breastbone and you work your way upwards, then there is a hole or an indentation right at the top of the breastbone, more properly called the sternum. That's known as the suprasternal notch. And if you press down there, it's quite uncomfortable to do, but if you do press down there, you will be able to feel your trachea right at the back. So the trachea runs down at the neck, and then it's going to go in the space in between the two lungs, and at the medium way down between the lungs, it's going to bifurcate into the two main stem bronchi, one of which is going to go into each lung. So let me draw this now here. So this is the trachea, and now it's going to bifurcate, and I'll draw this occurring here, like so. So here is the right main stem bronchus, and then here we'll have the left main stem bronchus. And this point of bifurcation of the trachea, this has a special name. This is known as the carina. So if you ever hear anyone referring to the carina, that just means the point where the trachea bifurcates into the two main stem bronchi, like so. Okay, now, so I don't particularly want to add the lungs onto this picture, but I think it's important to put this in perspective with the lungs, so I will just draw this in on this picture here. So here then comes the trachea down like so, and it's going to bifurcate at about this sort of level to give the right main stem bronchus, which went to the right lung, and then the left main stem bronchus, which went to the left lung. So there's the sort of position where the carina is going to be, with the two bronchi coming off it. Okay, now let me talk about the different angles that the right main stem bronchus and the left main stem bronchus make with this sort of horizontal line, because this actually is reasonably important to know about. So the angle that the right main stem bronchus comes off the trachea, or makes with this horizontal line here, is usually quoted as being around 45 degrees, whereas the angle that the left main stem bronchus makes with this horizontal line is usually quoted as being around 30 degrees. Now, why is that something that's worth knowing? Well, if you were to inhale some large foreign body, maybe a piece of Lego for an example, okay, if you were to inhale that and it was to go down into your lungs, which lung do you think it's more likely to end up in? So it comes down the trachea. Where's it more likely to go, down the right main stem bronchus or the left main stem bronchus? Well, of course, it's more likely to go down the right main stem bronchus because this one's steeper. So usually foreign bodies that you've inhaled, they end up in the right lung rather than the left lung, and that's a fact that is worth knowing clinically. Okay, so let me just annotate this picture more. So these are the main stem bronchi here. So I'll put that title on here. So as I say, this one is the right main stem bronchus, and then this one is the left main stem bronchus. So bronchi is the plural, bronchus, so take the I off and put US there. That's the singular. So we've got the main stem bronchi here. So the tracheobronchial tree, however, does not end there. These, of course, have entered the lungs, but these are going to continue to divide and split into smaller and smaller airways. Now, the picture gets horrendously complicated. I'll draw a little bit of it. So let's go on the right side here. So what's going to happen is the right main stem bronchus will split into two major branches. Then off this lower branch, we'll have another major branch coming off here, which will be the branch that majorly supplies the middle lobe. This one will supply the superior lobe, and then the continuation of this lower one down here, this will then go off to supply the lower lobe. So, you know, it splits loads and loads of times. Now, drawing a picture of this gets horrendously complicated because it very quickly becomes a horrendously complicated picture. So I'm not going to attempt to go any further than that with regards to drawing my picture. Instead, what I'm going to do is talk through the concept of the generation of an airway, which is a way of classifying airways by how many times you've had to split from the trachea in order to get to that airway. So it's a number that you can ascribe to any airway, which tells you basically, if you were to work your way back up to the trachea, how many splits would you go through. So we're going to talk then about the concept of the generation of an airway. So I'll just put that as the title, generation of an airway. Okay, so starting off with the trachea then. The trachea is given generation 0 because remember, as I've just said, the concept of the generation is how many times have you had to split since the trachea to get to that airway. The trachea, you haven't had to split a single time to get to the trachea since the trachea, so it makes sense that it should be ascribed generation 0. So the generation of the trachea is indeed 0. So now, hopefully you can guess what the generation of the main stem bronchi is going to be, or rather not guess, work out. So the main stem bronchi, so if I was in, let's say, the left main stem bronchus here, and I wanted to work out what generation it is, I'd work my way back up to the trachea and I'd say how many times did I have to go past the point where this split. And look, I went past 1, so I call that generation 1. So generation 1 airways are the main stem bronchi. Okay, so they are generation 1 airways. And then it goes on. So you then have generation 2 airways, generation 3 airways. So for instance, this one here would be a generation 2 airway because you'd have to go through this split. So you'd have to go through overall 2 to get back to the trachea. So it continues on. Now, airways from 1 to 10, so generation 1 to 10 airways, those are what are known as bronchi. Now, this is not the definition of a bronchi, or a bronchus indeed. The definition of a bronchus is that it has cartilage around it. So we'll see when we study the histology of the tracheobronchial tree that the bronchi, they have a layer of cartilage in their wall structure. Okay, that's the definition of bronchi. However, generation 1 to 10 airways, these are the ones that tend to actually be the bronchi. They tend to have cartilage in them. So this isn't a rule that will work in absolutely every single case. So you might be able to find, let's say, a generation 11 airway, which should be called a bronchus. But the general rule is that generation 1 to 10 airways, these are going to be bronchi. And as I say, the characteristic feature of bronchi is that they have cartilage in their wall. They also have submucosal glands, but that's not as distinguishing as the cartilage. The cartilage is the major thing that you will instantly spot in the wall of a bronchus, which distinguishes it from a smaller type of airway known as a bronchiole. Okay, right. So, generation 1 to 10 airways, these are bronchi, and their big feature is that in their walls, so in the wall of the tube, they're going to have cartilage at some layer. Indeed, it will be the outer layer. And this cartilage is going to make them quite solid airways, so they're very strong airways, okay, very structurally sound. So, generation 1 to 10 airways, those are what we know as bronchi, and they have this cartilage in the outer portion of their vessel wall. Now, generation 11 to generation 16 airways, these are now known as the conducting bronchioles. Okay, so we will have a different type of bronchiole as well. Generation 17 to generation 19 are going to be what are known as respiratory bronchioles. But we're going to firstly start off with conducting bronchioles, and we'll see the difference between conducting bronchioles and respiratory bronchioles in just a moment. So, conducting bronchioles, these are effectively doing the same job as bronchi. They are just conduction vessels, hence why they're called conducting bronchioles. So their job is just to conduct air through the system. But they're much, much smaller, and they no longer have cartilage in their walls, so they're much less strong. They have much more of a tendency to collapse down than the bronchi. Bronchi, they won't ever collapse unless there's something ghastly wrong. Bronchioles, they're much more squishy and have much more a tendency to collapse down. Okay, so conducting bronchioles are generation 11 to generation 16 airways. And let me just remind you what is meant by the generation. This is just telling you effectively how small the airway has got, because it's telling you how many times you have split since the trachea to get to this airway. Okay, so next we have generation 17 to generation 19. These are now called respiratory bronchioles. So these are still known as bronchioles, but they now have alveoli coming off them, and that's why they're called respiratory bronchioles, because their purpose no longer is merely just to conduct air through them. They have alveoli coming off them, and therefore they actually have a role in the transport of gases, gas exchange, hence why they're now called respiratory bronchioles rather than just mere conducting bronchioles. So let me just draw some pictures. So, if we have a picture then of a conducting bronchiole, here is a conducting bronchiole. It's just a boring tube. Its job is just to conduct air. It's not got any alveoli coming off its side. Now let's say it's actually a generation 16 conducting bronchiole. So when it splits into two more smaller bronchioles, these are now going to be respiratory bronchioles as a general rule. And of course, the body does not follow these exact rules, but as a general rule to help you understand, this is a good enough approximation. So these are now going to be respiratory bronchioles, and they're therefore going to have alveoli coming off. Now there's actually a special name for generation 16 airways. These airways just before you split into respiratory bronchioles and start having alveoli coming off the airways, these are actually known as terminal bronchioles. So if you ever hear anyone ever talking about a terminal bronchiole, then it is a commonly used term. You do hear it thrown about a lot. That's what it actually means. It just means one of these last conducting airways, one of the last, well indeed the last airway that has no alveoli coming off it. The branches of this airway are going to now have alveoli coming off, and they're going to now be respiratory airways rather than just conducting airways. Okay, so now we're on generation 17. These are respiratory bronchioles, and now coming off the sides then, you're going to have alveoli like so. So you're still going to have a distinguishable tube. Look, here is the tube, but it's now got alveoli coming off the side, like so. So there's a respiratory bronchiole. Here is another respiratory bronchiole with some alveoli coming off the side, like so. So these are now generation 17 airways here, and they're now respiratory airways. They now have alveoli coming off the sides of them. Okay, so generation 17 to 19, those are the respiratory bronchioles. They're just like these bronchioles, except they've now got alveoli coming off them. Well, actually, they're not so much like this. They're much, much smaller. We'll see the histological difference between them. These ones tend to have quite a bit of bronchial smooth muscle cells around them, whereas these, they do to an extent have some smooth muscle around them, but it's generally been lost by this point. And they just really have an epithelium. But we'll discuss that when we come on to the histology later on. Okay, so generation 17 to 19, those are the respiratory bronchioles. Finally, or well, not quite finally, generation 20 to 22, these are no longer called bronchioles. These are now called alveolar ducts. So what's happened to these ones? Why are they no longer called bronchioles? Well, what happens here is, you know how I said that effectively you would view these respiratory bronchioles as a tube with alveoli coming off them, where it's kind of different for an alveolar duct. In an alveolar duct, it's more that the tube is made up of alveoli. It's loads of alveoli sort of aggregated together. So let me show you what I mean by this. So let's say that we have our last respiratory bronchiole now. So I'll draw another picture here. So let's say here is a little respiratory bronchiole, and let's say it's a generation 19 airway. So now when it splits, it's going to split in our lovely, ideal, approximate world here into two alveolar ducts. And these are now just going to be made up of alveoli, so they're going to look like this rather than like this. Notice the difference in what I'm drawing here. Okay, their walls just consist of alveoli. So you've got lots of alveoli with a sort of central duct in the middle forming the tube, but you can't really call it a tube with alveoli off. The tube is the alveoli rather than it being a tube with alveoli coming off, and that's the reason for the change in terminology here. So these are alveolar ducts, like so. So you can see how I've drawn the picture very different. The walls are made up by the alveoli, whereas in the case of a respiratory bronchiole, no, the walls are the tube, and then coming off the tube you have a few alveoli. Whereas here you don't have any sort of spaces where you don't have an alveolus coming off. Okay, so here are some alveolar ducts here. Then finally there is generation 23, and that's where it ends. And generation 23 is where you just have a blind end, okay? And this is with an alveolus. So you'll have now a generation 22 alveolar duct, like so. So here's a generation 22 alveolar duct, and it has to end at some point. So rather than splitting into two even smaller alveolar ducts, it's just going to end with an alveolus in that blind end way there. So that's now the generation 23 airway. So this blind end alveolus here is considered generation 23 airways. Okay, so this, I hope, gives you some intuition for the tracheobronchial tree. Of course, these numbers, this concept, this is sort of like our ideal world. This is a model of the real lungs. You will be able to find airways where the generation doesn't match up to what its histological appearance is. So, as I said earlier, you could find most likely in your lungs a generation 11 airway, which would be classified as a bronchus rather than a conducting bronchiole, because it had the cartilage present. So these aren't exact rules that you can apply, but it is a nice model that helps you make sense of the structure of the lungs in your head. Okay, so I hope that gives you some insight into the structure of the lungs and how this conduction system actually links up to all the alveoli. And it's an important point to stress that every single alveolus that is in the lung will be connected to this great big conduction system, otherwise its existence would be pointless. Remember, its purpose is to transport gases from the air that you're bringing into it into the blood, and take out waste product gases such as carbon dioxide from the blood and put it back into the air. So if it's not connected to this conduction system, this tracheobronchial tree, then its existence is totally useless. Okay, right. So I think we will have a break here, and in the next video what we will turn our attention onto is the histology of the lungs. So we'll talk about the histology firstly of a bronchus, then we'll talk about the histology of a conducting bronchiole, then we'll talk about the histology of a respiratory bronchiole, because as I say, they do differ quite a bit, and then we'll talk about the histology of alveolar ducts and alveoli, and that will be done together because of course alveolar ducts just consist of alveoli, so by discussing the histology of an alveolar duct we discuss the histology of an alveolus. And then finally we'll end the video just by talking about basic lung volumes, for instance functional residual capacity, reserve volume, tidal volume, inspiratory reserve volume, expiratory reserve volume, total lung capacity, what all of those words mean. Okay, so we'll have a break here.